Hey there, this is Kara Jane with Ice Cream for Buttercream, and in today's video we're going to be answering the question, how long does cake batter last? So one of the most asked questions I get is, how long does cake batter last, or can I make my cake batter ahead of time? So in this experiment, I'm going to compare cake mix batter and scratch cake batter to see if it's possible to do that. So I've wanted to do this experiment for a long time, but I wanted to do it the right way and with a lot of different factors. So it's taken me a lot of time to get it done, but I have collected a bunch of information that I hope is really valuable to you. I must say that when I went into this experiment, I had some preconceived notions about how it would turn out, and I was kind of surprised. So I don't want to give it away, but you'll just want to watch to the end, because I have a little bit of information about the different types of cake mixes and the different types of cake recipes, and how that can play a big part in how long your cake batter is going to last. So here are the things that we're going to talk about in this video. We're going to talk about experimenting with cake batter, how long cake batter lasts, refrigerating cake batter, freezing cake batter, storing cake batter, baking cold cake batter, and then whether you can leave cake batter out overnight. So first, let's talk a little bit about this experiment. So for this experiment, I've baked cake layers for both cake mix cakes and scratch cakes. That way you can get a better idea of what will happen and how this will affect both types of cakes, no matter which one you prefer. So it doesn't really matter to me which one you like to bake or eat. Either one is your choice, but I did want to make an experiment that included both, so I didn't leave anyone out. So for the cake mix batter, I used Betty Crocker vanilla cake mix. It's in the 15.25 ounce box, and I mixed it and baked it according to the instructions on the box. I didn't add anything to it or try to do a doctored cake mix recipe. I just went straight for the instructions on the box. And I picked vanilla because I figured that way you can really see the texture better whenever it's baked, and I could get a good comparison that way. And so for the scratch cake batter, I used my recipe for my favorite vanilla cake recipe, and you can find that recipe on my website. I'm going to put a link to this post on my website down in the description below, and I'm going to also put a link to that recipe that I'm using for the scratch vanilla cake. And I really want to get a few things out of the way just before we start the experiment. They're really important to know. I'm going to talk a little bit about the differences in cake mix cakes and scratch cakes as it will pertain to how long cake batter may last. I do have a post on my website that will go even deeper into this topic. If you're interested, I will put a link to that in the description below as well. So first, we'll talk about cake mixes. They have additives in them. I'm not saying that's good or bad. I am just saying that it may make a difference in how long your cake batter will hold up. So additives that they put in cake mixes, they're essentially what makes them more stable and predictable. All right, so for the scratch cakes, these are, of course, a little bit more involved, but there are a few more factors involved in how long your cake batter is going to last for scratch cakes. Some cakes use baking soda and some cakes use baking powder, and actually some of them use both. So I do have some more detail on the differences between the two. It's also on my website. I will put a link to that as well in the description, and it just talks about the differences between baking soda and baking powder and what they do. So I'm just going to summarize it here for you real quick though, so that you'll get a good idea of why that makes a difference. So baking powder is double acting. And what that means essentially is that it just bubbles twice. It does it once the liquid hits the batter, and then once you put the cake into the oven. So it reacts to the liquid and it'll react to the heat. So what that means is if you don't bake the cake right away, right after you mix the batter, is that it may not have as much rise, because essentially you're only going to get the second rise or the second reaction, which is when the heat is incorporated. You may still get rise. It may just not be quite as much as you would get if you had just mixed up the batter and baked it immediately. So that's scratch cakes using baking powder. But now let's talk about scratch cakes that use only baking soda. And baking soda is, remember, it's different than baking powder. So baking soda is only going to react once, and baking soda starts reacting right when you add the liquid. So you're only going to get that reaction. You're not really going to get the second reaction from the heat. So let's say you bake up your batter and you set it to the side. Well, you've already gotten the bubbling up reaction. And if you let it fall or you don't bake it right away, you wait another day or so, you may not get a very good rise on your cake because the reaction is already over, essentially. And what I mean by reaction, you need the bubbles to help lift and puff up the cake. That's what's going to make it fluffy and give it a good texture. If you don't have that rise in your cake, that's when you get the really dense cake kind of packed down. And sometimes it even has those gluey streaks in it where it just feels kind of rubbery. And that's what you don't want. So then to add confusion on top of everything else, sometimes you have cake batter that will call for baking powder and baking soda. So this one, just like anything else, it's going to have to be an experiment. This one might be a little bit better than if your recipe only had baking soda in it, because you're still going to get a second rise whenever you pop it into the oven and heat is incorporated. But just like I said, it's going to be an experiment. So just remember, though, that baking soda and baking powder aren't the same thing, and you do not want to go substituting one for another because it really does make a difference. And if you're confused on that, just go to the description below and hit the link that talks about baking powder versus baking soda, and it's going to go into even more detail there. Okay, so finally we can get to the experiment. I wanted to try out this experiment with a bunch of different factors, but I'm only one person, and so I can't account for all different factors, so I just did the best that I could. So I decided to do the experiment based on the average cake mix, and then one based on my scratch cake. And again, I'll put the link to that recipe in the description below. So my scratch recipe does not use baking soda. It uses baking powder. So remember, you get two reactions, one when you add the liquid and one when you add it to the heat source. So remember, if you're just using a recipe that is only using baking soda, you might have an issue with the rise. Okay, so here's the experiment that I did. So for both the cake mix batter and the scratch cake batter, I baked one right away. I mixed up the batter. I baked one of each layer right away. And then I chilled the batter in the fridge for an hour and then baked a layer. And then for another layer, I chilled the batter in the fridge for 24 hours and then I baked the cake layer. And then for the last one, I froze the batter in a Ziploc freezer bag for a week. And then I defrosted it in the fridge and then I baked a layer for each, both the cake mix and the scratch cake batter. All right, so the first one is the batter that was mixed and baked right away. So for the cake mix, this cake layer was mixed up according to the instructions and it was baked right away. The cake rose perfectly. It was fluffy. It was moist. It tasted good. Just everything you would expect from a cake mix. Okay, for the scratch cake that I mixed and baked right away, the cake rose perfectly. The texture was soft. Scratch cakes seem to be sometimes a little bit more dense than cake mix cakes, but it wasn't a dense cake per se. It came out exactly how it normally does when the batter is baked right away. It just had a soft crumb, a little bit more fine of a crumb than cake mix cakes, but it was moist and tender and it tasted great. So for this part of the experiment, when the batter was mixed and baked right away, the cake mix and the scratch cake both turned out exactly how they were supposed to. And that gave us a good control for our experiment. All right, so the next part of the experiment is the batter that was mixed and then it was chilled for an hour in the fridge and then it was baked. So the first one is the cake mix, and I mixed up the batter. I left it in the bowl. I covered the bowl with plastic wrap, put it in the fridge and let it sit there for an hour. And then when I pulled it out, I sort of mixed it a little bit with a rubber spatula, but I didn't go at it with any kind of a mixer. And then I poured it in my pan and baked it. So this cake didn't rise as quickly. I sort of watched it from the outside of the stove and I just noticed that it didn't rise near as quick, but it did rise. I did have to leave it in the oven for about 5 minutes longer, and probably it was because the batter was chilled. But the cake did turn out just as good as if I had baked it immediately. It still ended up rising just about the same as the last one, which was baked immediately. It was moist, fluffy, and it tasted good. Okay, for the scratch cake version of this, the batter was mixed, left in the mixing bowl, covered with plastic wrap, and then I stored it in the fridge for an hour and then baked it. The batter was still chilled when I added it to the pan. I don't warm it up, and I just mixed it up a little bit with a spatula, but not very much. I didn't get a mixer out. So this kind of ended up the same way as the cake mix version of this experiment. It didn't rise quite as quickly, but it did end up rising just as much as it normally would have. So the cake turned out just as good as if I'd baked it immediately after. The texture was soft and it was moist and it tasted good. So to summarize this experiment, both the scratch cake and the cake mix cake turned out just fine when I covered it and chilled the batter for an hour. All right, for the next experiment, it's the batter that was mixed and then it was chilled for 24 hours and then baked. First one up is the cake mix. This cake mix was mixed up and then left in the mixing bowl. I covered it with plastic wrap and then I just let it sit in the fridge for 24 hours. And then when I was ready to bake it, I just pulled it out of the fridge and I just mixed it a little bit with my spatula. I did not get a mixer out and then I poured it into the pan and baked it. I actually saw no difference between this one and the others that I baked. The one that I baked immediately and the one that I had chilled for an hour. It literally was the same. The cake mix cake was the same. It made no difference that I left it in the fridge for 24 hours. It was still moist, fluffy, and it tasted good. All right, the next one is the scratch cake. And this cake batter was mixed, left in the mixing bowl, covered it with plastic wrap, just like the other one. And then I chilled it for 24 hours. The batter was still cold when I put it in the pan. Just remember, I just mixed it up a little bit, but not with a mixer. I saw a very little difference between this one and the other two that I had baked. It may have been slightly more dense, but it wasn't a huge difference. And not enough difference to say, I don't really think that you should do this at all. So the 24-hour later thing with the scratch cake didn't make a huge difference. And I gotta say, I was pretty surprised at that. Okay, to sum up this experiment, when we chilled the batter for 24 hours and baked it, the cake mix that cake had no difference at all. It was still the same. I could not see any difference at all. The scratch cake was a little bit more dense, but it was not a huge difference and it still tasted great. All right, now we're going to do the last experiment on the two cakes. And this is batter that was mixed and then it was frozen in a freezer bag for a week. Then I defrosted it in the fridge for about 8 hours and then baked it. All right, so first we'll talk about the cake mix. This batter was frozen in a Ziploc bag for 1 week. I defrosted it overnight in the fridge and then I let it sit out for about 20 minutes so that it wasn't super cold. And then I sort of smashed it around in the bag. I didn't really mix it up, just sort of smashed it around a little bit to mix it up. And I cut a hole in the corner of the bag and then I just squirted it into the pan that way. And the batter was still cold, but it was not frozen and it wasn't super chilled when I added it to the pan. So for the cake mix cake, it rose mostly in the middle. The outside, like a ring around the outside, didn't rise quite as well as the middle. It kind of looked a little weird. And it wasn't quite as fluffy and moist as the other experiments that I'd run on the cake mix, but it still tasted good. And it was a little more dense, wasn't as great, but it still tasted good. And I think it would still pass as a good cake. All right, so now we get to the scratch cake, and this is when I started to get a little nervous. So the batter was done the same way, frozen in a Ziploc bag for a week. It was defrosted overnight in the fridge, and then I let it sit out on the counter for 20 minutes. I sort of smashed it around in the bag, and then I cut a corner of the bag, squirted it into the pan, and baked it cold. It wasn't frozen, it wasn't too chilled, but the batter was still cold. So the edges of this scratch cake did not rise quite as much. And it also needed about 5 extra minutes to bake it. It did turn out a bit more dense though than the others. It also felt a little bit more doughy than the others. It was still edible. It still tasted good, but I would say that the texture was just a little bit, I think doughy is probably the best term that I could use for it. It was still edible and it still tasted good, but the texture just wasn't as good as it could be. It just felt a little bit more compact. All right, so to break down this last experiment, the cake mix was edible. It tasted great, but it still was a little bit more dense and it didn't rise. The whole cake didn't rise. Mostly the middle rose for the cake mix one. And then the scratch cake, it did rise, but the texture felt a little bit more doughy and dense and a little bit more compact than I would have liked. So all in all, I would not recommend freezing it for a week and then baking it. If you had to, you have to, but I certainly wouldn't do that and then sell the cake. Maybe for your family, it might be okay, but they're just not at their best if you do it this way. All right, so I want to break down some of these results, and I want to talk about some really important tips and some FAQs here. First, you need to make sure that you're mixing up your cake batter according to the recipe instructions. It really does make a difference. And the way it makes a difference is how the cake is going to rise. If you are supposed to be whipping up your egg whites, or you're supposed to be creaming the butter and the sugar together for several minutes, that's incorporating more air. And that's going to give you a bigger rise, a bigger lift in your cake. So those kinds of things are really important. And the reason why they tell you to add ingredients in certain ways and at certain times, that's because it helps them mix better that way, or it helps with the rise of the cake. So the recipe instructions really do make a difference. So the main question of this video was, how long does cake batter last? So the better question to ask is, how long can you keep cake batter and it still be okay, or it still bake okay? The batter will probably last a while in the freezer, but the longer you keep it chilled or in the freezer before baking it, the less chance you're going to get a cake that rises properly and with good texture. Essentially, I think based on this experiment, I wouldn't keep batter any longer than a week in the freezer. And that's really only if you're using a cake mix. Even then, your cake isn't going to be as good as if you had mixed it up that day or the day before. If you're making a scratch cake, honestly, I wouldn't freeze the batter at all. You can freeze it after it's baked. And I do have a video on that, and I will leave a link to that in the description as well. But I would not freeze a scratch cake batter at all. If you don't want to waste cake batter and you're only going to be baking it for your family, it's probably going to be okay. It's not going to be the best outcome, but I certainly, like I said before, wouldn't sell it to a client if you're selling cakes. So for best results, I'd make it the day you mix it up. That's the absolute best way to do it. And then if you have to, you can chill it for an hour or bake it the next day. But make sure that you're not using a cake recipe that only uses baking soda, because I don't think that that's going to turn out well for you. All right, I want to answer this next question, and it's, can you refrigerate cake batter? And so the answer is obviously yes, you can. But in some instances, it's generally okay to chill the batter for an hour or two, or even overnight like we saw. Cake batter that is made from cake mixes obviously might do a little bit better than scratch cakes, but it is possible. The next question is, can you freeze cake batter? And we just talked about that. Technically, you can. But when you bake it, you're just not going to get the same reaction as if you had just made the cake batter and baked it. The longer you freeze the batter, the less the cake will turn out like it is supposed to. All right, so the next question is, how do you store cake batter? It's always best to make the batter right away if you can. But if you can't, just like we talked about, cover it in a bowl with some plastic wrap and put it in the fridge. It's okay to do that for a couple of hours or even until the next day, but then you really want to bake it. If you want to freeze the batter, remember, like I said, I wouldn't suggest doing that, but if you're using a cake mix batter, it might be okay. But you could freeze it by just putting it in a freezer Ziploc bag and pushing all of the air out of it and just kind of lay it flat in your freezer. So just understand also that you're going to have to defrost the batter before you bake it. Just remember that the longer you go between the time of mixing up the cake batter and baking it, the less chance that you're going to get a cake with a good texture and a good rise. Next question is, can you bake cold batter? And we've talked about this. You can pour chilled batter right out of the mixing bowl or out of your freezer bag right into the pan and go ahead and bake it. You might have to bake it for a little bit longer, maybe 5 minutes, but you do want to watch it. It is possible, though, to bake chilled cake batter. Okay, can I leave cake batter out overnight? No, you do not want to ever leave cake batter out overnight. If you're going to save cake batter, make sure that you keep it in the refrigerator or the freezer or something like that. You do not want to just leave it out to room temperature. I mean, unless you're in a cold climate or something, which I'm not, but you just want to be safe and keep that batter chilled. So what's the best way to make cakes ahead of time? So the best way to do that is either to bake the batter the day that you mix it up or the next day, or go ahead and bake the cakes and then freeze them later. And like I said earlier, I have a link to a video on that down in my description below. Be sure to check that out because you really can go ahead and bake your cakes and then freeze them, and they'll freeze for several weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks usually. And if you freeze them the right way, no one's going to know that they were frozen. You won't get freezer burn on them. And actually, I find that they seem more moist to me once I've frozen them and then defrost them. But go check that video out. It's going to explain to you how I like to cover them and chill them and freeze them, and then how to actually defrost them the proper way as well. All right, I hope that you have enjoyed this experiment. I had a lot of fun doing this. It was a lot of work, but I learned a lot, and I hope you did too. I have to say that I was pretty surprised at the outcome. I was surprised that the scratch cake batter was able to last as long as it did, and that it actually did still rise even after I had frozen it. It didn't turn out the best that it could, but I was kind of surprised that it wasn't completely flat. So that was really interesting. But if you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment section below, and I will be happy to help in any way that I can. Or if you have any tips, make sure to leave those down there as well so everyone else can hear about them. And I will see you next time. Bye.